Welcome to Going In Blind. I'm your host, Zach Tidwell, and my guest today, I'm going to try and introduce without giving away too many of the details, but I think it's fair to say that the earlier years of his life were floundering, or as he might call them, spent on a lot of detours, but it wound up in a really, really powerful place because at 53 years old, he and his wife bought a home to turn into a shelter, and that has since almost taken him on a new career. They founded the nonprofit Good Samaritan Home, and to date have now served, housed, and mentored over 2,500 people coming out of the prison system so that they can go on to live productive lives and get off on the right foot. And I think what's so important about this is in this country, I think we forget that our penal systems are supposed to be for reform, not just a way to grind people into the dirt. We're supposed to give people a second chance. And I love that they're helping do that. So this is going to be something that I think is very powerful on a lot of different levels. But before we do get into it, just a couple quick announcements as usual. First, if you aren't aware of my story or familiar with the work that I do, head over to my website at zachtidwell.com. You can read a little bit about me there and join my mailing list so that you can get announcements about the big projects that I have going on behind the scenes now. And also, if you've been listening to the show for a while, please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. And if you prefer to watch through podcasts and see this beautiful face interviewing people every week, then head on over to YouTube because these are now available as video episodes as well. And I did forget to mention that my guest today is also an author who has won 41 literary awards for his novel that is out right now called Running as Fast as I Can. I'm sure we'll get into that too. So without further ado, so I can let him tell his story, please welcome John Graham. John, thank you for coming on.
Very glad to be here, Zach. I really am.
Yeah, you look great, look nice and happy. Your skin's glowing. I appreciate you taking the time.
I've never been told that I'm glowing before, but
Yeah.
you should be a fiction writer as well.
Yeah. You have a pregnant glow. So
Now, that was a different story.
I know you said you had a busy week or a hectic week, so I appreciate you making this work, man. I figured a great place to start here, and I'm just pulling up the message that I had from you so that I don't misquote you here, but I think this really stuck out to me when you sent this to me. And so these are your words, and I want to start here and see where this takes us. You told me that you said, I grew up in a family where we lived alone together. There was a quiet desperation in the house and no direction given to us regarding our future plans. Can you speak more? I mean, we lived alone together. I feel like alone is a heavy statement, but also uh, the concept that there was no guidance or talk of the future planning is so foreign to me and how I grew up. And I wanted to delve into that because I think I would suspect that's probably what led you on some of these detours is because you had to figure all that out on your own. So can you speak to that?
Well, I'm 77 right now, and I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and my parents were coming out of the Depression, coming out of the war, and their major concern was providing for their family, something that in the Depression they couldn't do. So they spent their time just making sure they had a roof over our head and food on the table. Communication that the kids do today or parents do today, that's, I think, is a fairly new concept that came out of the 60s and 70s. In fact, I'm still hesitant with all the hugging that goes on because it seems too familiar.
Really?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I find myself gravitating to the back of the room. In some respects, that's why I enjoyed being a journalist at one point, because you're there to observe, not to necessarily be part of it. I could never be a politician because you have to get in and mix and mingle and what I call mangle, uh, because we we grew up as long as you had a roof over your head. It's like my wife said about her father. she asked her father, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Of course I do. I provide for you." Because to say "I love you" was a foreign concept in our generation. It was implied, it was understood. And so it was the downside was that I was coming from a working class family. There was never any direction to go beyond working at the mill when you graduated high school, because this was Pittsburgh and everybody worked at the mill.
Mhm.
You never asked somebody where you work. You said, "What shift do you work?" Because it was a given, because the mill was the town. And I remember driving through smoke so thick you couldn't breathe for 3 miles, which was common. That was how we lived. And so when I went to college, I picked it on my own. I went on my own. I paid for it on my own. I worked all summer selling books door to door to pay for my college tuition. And when I graduated college, I had a BA degree in psychology and no idea what to do with it, because no one ever told me you should go into this field or that field. And so it was all trial and error. It's like if you were to send somebody out into a new town and say, "Find your way," there's no map. You just keep walking until you find where you're going, and you have no idea where the roads are because there's no road signs. That's what our generation lived with, at least in my family. And even today, when I go to a high school reunion, I see kids who grew up in families with structure or direction, and they went into college and graduate school and professional fields, and I call it a sprint. They ran right out of the gate to their success. And some of us don't know how to run. We feel like we're always behind everybody else, and we're running as fast as we can, but we can't keep up with those who started ahead of us. That's
I
the
was
whole
one.
concept.
I was wondering where that book title came from. I love that. And if you don't mind, I'd like to pick your brain more on that growing up like that, because it is obviously different generations, but also, so I don't have grandparents in my life. My parents or grandparents on my mother's side are dead, and I never I met my grandfather, but he had a genetic disease to where by the time I was born, he was already in a vegetative state. My grandmother was already dead. I have that disease too, which is really fun. But I had on my dad's side, my grandparents are just useless, so they've never been in my life, and so I haven't, as growing into a young man, and then now I'm about to turn 30. Like I've never gotten to have those conversations with an elder who is my blood, I guess, or on this level, and not to, I guess, to hear what it was like growing up in that time as well. Because I think specifically what stood out to me, I guess, on one hand, immediately when you talked about almost the fact that your parents, I mean, it sounds like just, and you can tell me if I'm wrong here, they were solely focused on existing because surviving was what they had to do during the Depression.
That's a very good way to put it.
And the lack of emotion, and even you being uncomfortable with almost expressing like physical signs of love. Like my family always hugs. It's always been, say I love you every time that we're saying bye to each other and stuff like that. And I just grew up that way. Do you feel, because the other thing that stood out to me on that is, on like my Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that existence level, your physiological needs are need to be met to move on to the next thing. And it sounds your parents probably didn't have that, and that is might have been why they were still operating on that lower level. But do you feel like there was capacity for emotion? Like they had capacity for emotion, or that just wasn't even almost in their lexicon?
I would say my mother in particular grew up in a part of uh, part of the mill towns around Pittsburgh that was so poor that this was before any government programs were available. It was so poor that they would go out and gather coal that fell from the coal trucks onto the street. they would gather that coal and bring it back to heat their house. And they would get food from the churches because they had literally no food, because my grandfather was a World War I veteran who has been uh, damaged in the war. He couldn't work. He couldn't even lay in a bed because his lungs were so damaged from the gas. So there was no money when she grew up. And my father grew up in a family, and I swear this is a true story, that when he was growing up at 3 years old, that family did not communicate. He took a pair of scissors as a child and punctured his eye as an accident and blinded himself and did not even tell his mother until that night, because you don't communicate emotions. You don't communicate in that generation. Now, you bring that into my generation, and we didn't have that severity, but we still had that inability to express ourselves. So I was luckily strong enough to determine my own course. I just made a lot of mistakes.
And that I was curious when you said that. I mean, because you did, what made you going out to college, especially paying for it on your own, and then on top of that, no one in your family having even really expressed that that was an option to you or having supported it. It's layers and layers of you having huge balls and being operating as purely as an individual. Like what do you remember what led to that?
That's interesting. I do remember I wanted to go to a summer camp to work up in upstate New York. And I remember taking a bus on my own through New York City up to upstate New York and spending the summer in this camp working as a waiter in this restaurant in this summer camp. And I did that completely on my own. And I think it's just just an extreme, I hate to say confidence, but that's probably what it is. Confidence that if I don't do something, nothing will get done. And so coming out of a negative environment, you can learn from that and say, at least I know I don't want to do that. Uh, Via negativa, you can learn from the way of the negative. And just because you have been given a setback, that doesn't mean that is going to be forever. It's up to you what you do with that setback. It's like Hemingway said, we are all broken by life, but some of us are stronger in the broken places. And that has become my motto. I've determined that I yes, my background in some degree was broken, but it's not going to be forever if I can be stronger because of it. It just takes longer.
And I think it's so important. I talk about this all the freaking time. We, regardless of what is going on around you, regardless of, in whatever context, in this context, whatever was going on around you, you do have the choice to make that change. And you already kind of touched on that but I talk about it a lot in the mental health context where it's like, yeah, you can't choose how you feel, but you can choose what you're going to do about it. Perspective is another one. And it sounds like you've had that even when you and I were talking offline before we started. And you talked about the detours, and specifically that you call them detours because they've all contributed to where you ended up today. But that speaks to where your mind is and how you have chosen to view things, because a lot of people could view that in a different way. And I'm curious as we get into this further, I guess, to see if maybe that perspective of viewing those detours as detours and not fuck ups, or, oh, this was another area I failed and I'm having to shift, if that was always there, if that was something that came later. Cause I think there's probably a lot of people, whether it's your generation or immediately following, or even in my generation, that are still in that the detours, and you're not, maybe not, like, not recognizing them as detours, but as, so you came out of college, and I at least today, like, you really can't do a whole lot in the psychology world without at least a a graduate degree. So
We
what
need a
happened?
master's in social work or
Yeah.
something. There's some sort of counseling degree, and even then, it's you end up working for the welfare department, which is not a bad job. It just doesn't pay enough to live on.
Hmm. Is that what the case was when you graduated with that, your undergraduate degree?
Well, we didn't have as many social programs back in 1970 as we have today. But keep in mind, this was 1970 when I graduated. We had just come through Kent State, and I was accepted. This is a strange story, but I was accepted in the Air Force as a navigator. I thought it would be a great way to pick up girls if I were an Air Force officer. But I stumbled onto Kent State campus on the day of the shootings. I was traveling, and I ended up involved, not in that particular protest, but I had gone on down the road to Ohio State University and got involved in a protest against the war. The guard was there surrounding us, and we literally had the guard uh, threatening all the protesters, and the protesters were antagonizing. It's exactly what you saw. It was uh, it was Black Lives Matter on steroids, and nothing was burned, nobody was shot, but we knew that somebody was shot just 2 hours previous. So
And
I came back to campus and I said, there's no way I could ever put on a uniform after what I saw today. So I gave up what could have been an Air Force career, and that was a point where I think I made a conscientious decision. But in fact, I still was, we had the draft then. And so I was obligated by the draft. And I spent 2 years working in Detroit as a children's home counselor to do my draft obligation. So you can't avoid your responsibilities, but you can find an alternative. And the trouble is that some of those, you pay a high price for some of those decisions. Because if you go into the main line, if I had become an Air Force officer, my whole career would have gone down a different mainstream avenue. But here I was working in the inner city, and it was only temporary. And so after I was done there, I went and I became a truck driver. And then after that, I went off on my own. I started forming my own construction company, and teaching myself how to do construction work as I went along. And then following that, I went. We're talking about moving through several states now with a family, so you can make decisions, but they can be very expensive decisions because there's a cost for everything you do. These are what I now call detours because they certainly helped me in the long run, but in the short run, I was stumbling in the dark because there was nobody saying, if you had gone this direction, you could have avoided this pitfall.
so did you feel like you were stumbling when you were going through all that though? As you were, making it from one detour to the next, did you feel like that was stumbling?
Oh yeah, yeah, I did. Because I wished I knew what to do. Because the problem with having a degree is you tend to think that you're educated, but you're underqualified,
Hmm.
and so you like to think you're worth more when you have no experience, and so it's difficult again without direction. You tend to uh, you tend to make mistakes. Again, it's like running I like compare it to running a marathon. Is that you're going to fall down, and as long as you're willing to get up, the trouble is the course is not marked for some of us, and so we end up going on detours, and then we have to come back and find the course, and so we feel like we're struggling to keep up with people who know the secret route.
Yeah. Well, and I'm curious to dig into this more because a I just had a gentleman on, Baruch Halevi, and he lost his father to suicide, and it sounds it, when he talks about it, you can tell there's a lot. there's a lot of emotion there. It sounds angry when he talks about it, and it is specifically, I think, because it sounds like from what he said, it sounds like his father was in this perpetual state of I'm moving on from one thing to the next, but maybe not. I think probably in a different respect, in the sense that it sounds like he was. It seems like you were falling forward. It seems like he was not falling forward, if that's a fair way to put that without kind of speaking out of turn. And I think, it was striking to me when I read about you and dug into you more specifically because you've made it through all of this. And again, I think that cycle of despair that it sounds like his father probably fell into, and I've been there before. Obviously, if I reached the point of shooting myself in the face, it wasn't because I wasn't making progress in life. So I think it's a different I think that's a different thing for the sake of this discussion. But I think that stumbling that you're talking about is something that people get stuck in, and I think it leads to a lot of despair and then deaths of despair, like it did for his father. And with you feeling like it was stumbling, was that part of the equation? Is that something that were you? What was the dichotomy of, okay, I'm moving on to another career versus is as you're moving along, are you slipping into a worse and worse place?
Well, let me say this, Zach. I have great sympathy for that man's father
Mhm.
because I even have a scene in the book where the character, Daniel Robinson, seriously contemplates suicide because of all his mistakes. And he said, I railed against all my tormentors all my life, but I have done the same to others. I have become my worst enemy. And it's not a woe is me thing. It's a realization of our own sins, as we call it.
Mhm.
And so there's a part of me that's always aware. I remember when we were struggling. I had moved the family from Michigan down to Kentucky, couldn't find work, and we were starving. And so I called a guy in Texas and I said, "Do you have any work?" He said, "Plenty of work. Come on down." So I drove, packed up my truck alone, drove to Texas, had never been there before, and I was laying in this flea bag motel, and I watched this lizard climb up the wall of this motel, and I said, "What the hell am I doing here? Yeah, my family is 1,200 miles away. I had to leave them, and we were on food stamps at the time, one step ahead of welfare, and I can't provide for my family." And it was a hard time, and we were in debt too. But because somebody offered me a chance, it was actually a stranger that I had only met once, but he offered me a chance and he said, if you're willing to work hard. So again, that's that marathon idea. So one more step. And within 3 months, I worked 7 days every day, every week, every month. For 3 months, I had enough to bring my family down, pay off my debts, and we started what we call a little construction company. And we actually, for the first time in our marriage, we actually had a normal life. That was
Oh,
it.
how far into the marriage? Like, how many kids did you have at that point?
We had two, and we got
Okay.
married. See, that would have been 77. We were only about 5 years into the marriage,
Okay.
so the kids were young, very young. I think my daughter may have been in diapers even. So, but again, what they knew, here's the kick, is that because we kept moving, because after that, I'd wanted to go to graduate school and to do more with my life and simply build houses or actually build a part of a house, particularly with the oil economy struggling at that point. So I came back north and we moved the kids several times while I was in school. And they grew up with all these moves. And that to them was uh, as difficult as the issues that I went through. And it's ironic today, both of them, well into their 40s, have the same job, have the same house. They started off very stable and they stayed stable, and they
Yeah.
became part of the normal community that I never was because they learned from my negative. So that's a good thing.
Mhm. Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I moved around constantly growing up because my dad was military and then federal law
Same thing.
enforcement afterwards. And it's like, it's made me adaptable to living to it in new places. But even I go, I've finally settled at least in like the Denver metro area. I've moved once in the past, you know, I guess 6.5 years since I shot myself and like got back out on my own. But, it's funny. On one hand, it's been really nice to settle, but I also get the itch to like pick up and move again. I think because I'm just used to that. I'm like, I'm getting tired, getting restless. I need to move out of here. But it's interesting that they've gone in the like totally opposite direction. But for you, like when you were moving on from opportunity to opportunity, because even it sounds like the one in Texas was very successful. If I'm, you were,
It it
go
it, it
ahead.
was, but you either have to go big or go broke, and it's very hard to run a small shop when you're actually doing the work and then soliciting the work, and particularly when you don't know how to run a shop. But it was very successful, and I made what I thought to be a good living at the time. But again, it's very volatile in construction, and there's always somebody to underbid you. But the truth was that I was hungry to do more than build a $3 million house. There's a moral issue there, and that's part of the degree I had. Is that in coming out of the '60s, there was a compassion for the underdog. And it just last week, I was watching a documentary on the civil rights movement, and we have forgotten in this current generation how difficult it was for some people in the '60s, how they struggled for just basic issues that you and I take for granted, like voting or sitting on the bus where they want. And so there's an ingrained part of me that wants to be this cultural warrior if I can. So I came back to get a graduate degree to become a minister, thinking that I can make a difference in the community. The downside to being a minister is that it can be very political. And because the idea is that we pay your salary, we want to tell you what to do. And you think you're a leader, but the truth is you're a follower. So let's put it this way. I didn't do well as a minister.
Okay.
Yeah, I wasn't that nice.
Were you religious before that?
I spiritual,
Okay.
better word. I didn't
Okay.
do well with organized religion. Again, that's part of being mainline, being traditional. So I think of myself as very spiritual. I'm fascinated by studying the theologians, the history of the church. I believe deeply in the concept of the church. I just think the church is filled with a lot of people who are more political than they are spiritual. So
Mhm.
let's put it this way: the church is like an emergency room. There's a lot of bloody people. Unfortunately, sometimes we need somebody to bandage the wounds rather than encourage to wound one another. And
Mm.
so, ironically, that led me to my work in the prisons because the church wasn't as open to dealing with struggling people, what I call the homeless people who came to our door. So I left the church and I started the program Good Samaritan Home. I was 53 years old when I should have been looking at retirement. I was literally starting over. And again, what happened was all that work in construction allowed me to know how to remodel this old house, 140 years old, and we used it. We moved into it and remodeled this old Victorian as a homeless shelter. And that's when the Department of Corrections said, would you help us? We have guys coming out of prison who need a place to stay. If you will house them in your shelter, we will pay you because you now have a nonprofit. We'll pay you a per diem because it costs $109 a day to put somebody in prison. But if they're in the community, they can work. And if they work, they pay bills, they pay taxes, they pay child support, and we don't have to pay them to be in prison. So they become taxpayers instead of tax burdens.
Mhm.
And that was the beginning of Good Samaritan Home.
Wow. And do you, when you started working with the prison system, I guess from inside the church at first, was that, and it's specifically, I guess, when others would not, do you think that was that civil rights thread of you, the civil rights warrior that you were talking about, kind of coming through?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. We like to think of ourselves as leaders. We think of ourselves as prophets. That's why I get so irritated with politicians today who say, I believe what you tell me to believe. And if they just believe something and stick to it, I'd follow them. And if I didn't agree with them, I'd at least respect them for it. But
Because it's principles at
it's
that point.
principle, absolutely. And right now, we're definitely not seeing in politics, but and we're not seeing in the church. In fact, I don't joke about it, but it's almost a joke. I feel more comfortable in prison than I do in church board meetings because at least I know that guy in prison's got my back. I know I can trust him
Mm.
because he's more honest. He knows he's committed a crime. He knows he's a sinner. Yeah, he knows he needs someone to help him. But in church, we like to think that we're all okay.
Put on your Sunday suit and your Sunday best and go in there and put on the act of the showmanship. And I'm not, that sounded really,
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. Uh, and church should be, like I said, it's an emergency room. It's a place where we come in and say, Father, forgive me for I have sinned, and then go out and sin no more. But that doesn't mean you're perfect. It means that I'm just going to have to try a little harder
yeah.
and move on.
Yeah. I hope people listening realize I'm not shitting on people who go to church. I'm shitting on that, they're just like in any area of life, there are two-faced people. And sometimes there are people like you've talked about, or what this is, I'm speaking in regard to what you're speaking to, whereas the sinner who's acted like they aren't the sinner kind of thing, and the better than thou, that kind of dance that some people will do. I'm not shitting on religious people, but
No, I didn't pick that up at all because
okay.
there's I think if people are honest, if they're candid, I don't want people going around saying I want to bare my soul to every stranger I meet. But I think I think we need to go into there needs to be a recognition of a what we call a higher order, a recognition of some sort of a creator that gives us some oversight, some direction, or better yet, some accountability. Because the alternative to not believing in a creator is what we call utilitarianism. And that means whatever works is therefore right because it works. And out of that comes power makes right. And that is often what happens in authoritarian governments. Because I have the power, that makes it right.
And if the outcome is positive for me, then you're reinforcing it's a positive stimulus. Yeah.
And ironically, I've been thinking a lot about this lately that coming out of the 60s, we were very critical of the government, particularly after Watergate. But the truth is that democracy, as it was designed, is actually a very moral and very Christian response to the Creator. If we are all created in God's image, that makes us all brothers and sisters. And how can I look down on you and treat you as a lesser person if you're my brother and sister? And democracy says we all are created as children of God. Therefore, we don't need a king over us or a dictator over us because we can rule ourselves. But the idea of checks and balances means that I recognize that left alone, my tendency is to do the wrong or to sin, as we say. So
Yeah.
the three branches of government is a way of saying, like Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify.
And it's interesting, and that's because I fall more the camp that you do, where I'm spiritual, but I take issue, I guess, where my friction with religion comes in is specifically where people are involved in terms of the positions of power, which is, it's like any other organization where there's authority and but I think it is so great for people who are religious because of those tenets. Those are like just the guiding principles of religion are all they're great. Like, well, I can't, that's a very broad statement that I should have worded a little more carefully. But like when you, like the 10 Commandments, don't steal, don't murder someone, don't, covet thy neighbor. Those are all good. Those are pretty solid baselines to live upon. But it's interesting because, and I guess I'd like to pick your brain more on how that accountability with maybe being more in the spiritual lane plays out for you because, and I think you kind of touched on it, like even though we have those tenets that I think most people would agree on, that those are great guidelines to live by, we do tend towards, even though we are supposed to have been created or, treat each other equally, created equally with start off on common ground. We do as humans, it seems to be human nature to other people. That's what we do when we go to war. That's what we do when you get too attached to your ideas in politics and can't have a conversation with someone. And then all of a sudden the person on the other side of the aisle is the enemy instead of someone that you can come to the table and just talk with and see how they think. And so for you, where, because it's not a conventional, it sounds like it's not maybe a conventional framework that you fall under there. Where do you find that accountability from in the spiritual sense?
You mentioned the Ten Commandments, and it's very interesting because the Ten Commandments start off by saying that they reference to honor. It's a reference to God, and it starts off with the fact that there is a God, and we are accountable to that God, and then as a result, we're accountable to our neighbors. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not. It goes into the what they call the horizontal, because if we don't if we don't have a source of accountability, then there's nobody that can hold us accountable to the stealing part. But if we steal from a neighbor, then we have community chaos.
Neighbor
So
being society and our laws and that stuff.
that's right. So actually, it's a moral survival issue to have this recognition of accountability. And truth is, right now, what we're struggling with in our politics is this idea of accountable. Uh, do our system of checks and balances actually work? And if so, who's in charge? How do we balance one another? And that's what we're wrestling with. And we've been wrestling with that since 1789, when the Federalists were arguing with the Democratic Republicans. Jefferson and Adams were arguing over strong central government or decentralized states governments, and we're still arguing over that. And it's a debate that's good, but unfortunately, if we don't debate it, if one side overpowers the other, then we have an unbalance, and that's what concerns me today.
Yeah, because go ahead.
But I was going to say the best example, just listening to you here, uh, I think the best example of what the church should be doing was the civil rights movement, because civil rights at root was the theological movement that we are all accountable to God, black, white, or green. And the they the black community, they didn't simply go out and protest and say, I'm angry, I want my vote, I want my equality. They were trained, they were disciplined, They were under authority of their leadership, and they marched as a cohesive unit, and they did nothing without being part of the body of civil rights protesters. And that changed when the theology started to dissipate with Black Lives Matter, with that Black Power is what it was. And they were saying, I want power now from Whitey. And it became angry. Then out of that came the Vietnam protests, were simply angry protests. And now we're seeing chaos in our streets with so many protests where you literally burn down your neighborhood. And to me, at best it's unproductive. At worst, it destroys the culture.
I think it's definitely destructive because a lot of that stuff also, you get people, some people are there with the right intentions. A lot of them aren't. A lot of them are there to loot. A lot of them are there
Yeah.
to just cause chaos and pay no recourse for it. And that's a problem. So I think it's pretty fair to say that that's destructive objectively. And go ahead.
Well, I could say without uh, a unifying doctrine, a unifying belief, a unifying principle, I don't see how we can come together. We're going to have this chaos. And that's why the civil rights movement, I think, worked because they came in with a unifying belief in their creator God. And they said, because we are created the same as a white man, we we expect the same privileges as the white man, but we also are accountable to the same God. So we can't do the wrong that the white man is doing just because he's doing it. We have to be godly about that.
Yeah.
I normally never get into this much theology, but the truth is everything in life is based on our belief. It's just a matter of how we express it, not preach it, but express it through our actions.
Yeah. I mean, that is the old saying of actions speak louder than words. Like you could talk all day, but if you're not going to walk the walk, it doesn't mean anything. So
Oh, absolutely. In fact, my best sermons are the ones where I say nothing.
you just kind of let everything run its course or what?
No, actually, I do that through Good Samaritan Home. When a fella comes to me, I don't say, "Are you a Christian? Are you a believer? Are you a Jew? I don't ask anything. I say just this: Are you hungry? Because that's the language he hears. So if somebody's homeless, I have to speak his language, and his language is a warm bed and some food. And I don't ask anything other than that because my role is to uh, not talk my faith, but simply live my faith in practical ways.
And this is something I wanted to highlight, and just because I don't want to forget specifically, because now we're stepping into Good Samaritan Home, and because you touched on homeless, something I saw on your website, and I love this. It said we're giving people a hand up, not a hand out.
Yeah.
I think that is such an important, like, foundational belief to have as an organization who is going to help shepherd people from one phase of life into a better one. I think that is the don't give the man a fish, teach him how to fish, or don't hand him the food. But it's so I don't know where you want to start with this in terms of we know how it started, but I'm curious on so many levels of, okay, when this gentleman shows up to your door and he is homeless, has he been has he have these guys always been sent to you from the state? They are coming straight from prison to your doors?
Yes and no. They're all from the parole or probation officer. They either are coming directly from prison or they're coming what we call from the field. They're already in the community, but they're homeless, and they're on parole. And so, if they're on parole, that means they're accountable to a parole officer.
Mhm.
So, but we don't want people homeless because if you're homeless, what you'll do is I'll say, I need to survive. Well, so I'll steal this till I can survive, or I'll rob this store, or I'll rob this person, or I'll steal this car, and you're back in prison. But
Mm.
what we found is the primary need, Maslow's need here, coming out of prison, is a place to live. So the state said, if we can give people a place to live where they're safe, not just a crash pad, but because they have no money coming out. And so if we can give them a place to live for a temporary amount of time where they're accountable, not locked up, but accountable, we call it independent housing. And so we started with uh, one house. We started with my house, literally sharing my house with strangers.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, that's how it was. We had
Wow.
Reggie came to us in 2002. He was coming out of prison near Cleveland, and he was a black man coming all the way across state to this rural white community. So he was scared to death, and the community was scared to death. And there were protests, there were petitions to the council, there were threats. It got so bad that somebody stabbed me in front of the courthouse. It was violent. I had police protection at one point.
Wasn't this 2001?
We started in 2001, but Reggie came in 2002.
And it was that opposed
Oh yeah.
on racial grounds.
Well, never said, but it was. It was.
Wow.
Everything in our culture is on racial grounds. We just don't say that. And but I will tell you this: that of course we ended up in lawsuits, but what really wins the community is being a good neighbor. And so, come winter, we would make sure we take a snowblower and clean everybody's sidewalk in the entire block. And then we fixed up our house and kept it clean, kept it quiet,
Mm.
and we became uh, uh, the model for transformation in the entire block. And over time, people started cleaning their houses, and there was less crime in our neighborhood. And it became a better neighborhood, not because of us, but I think with our example. And so I say that you can preach all day long, but it's what you do with your shoe leather. That's what people hear.
I've never heard that before.
What happened, Zach, was the state said we need some more beds, so we bought another house across the street because my wife had a little inheritance from when her parents died, so she used all her personal money, and I bought this old house. It was 100 years old, and I spent 2 years climbing through every nook and cranny trying to remodel that thing. And we ended up allowing, I think, maybe 6 or 8 more beds, and then that allowed enough cash flow. We bought another one, and today we now have 21 houses in 3 counties, and on any given day we can house 100 men and women. But they're not locked down. It's not a dormitory. It's a boarding house arrangement.
Mhm.
And the idea is not to, we don't do programming. We simply say, this is a safe place for you. But what I want from you is you make your bed, you clean your own mess in the kitchen, you clean your own toilet mess. You be what I call a good roommate because that tells me where your head is. And if you don't make your bed and if you don't clean up your dishes, then you're thinking I. And I want you to think we, because we will keep you out of prison. I got you to prison. And that's what it's an old Navy SEAL trick because if you make your bed, you have control over something in your life. And that's how that's our program.
And that's so interesting. And I was about to ask you, I was like, so you're trying to get them to think of the collective because it is,
Yep.
and I would imagine even after being in prison, you've almost been like the institutionalization of it has trained you to lean harder into the I because you're surviving in there with killers and whatever else. Like,
Yeah.
wow.
You and I can't. I've never been to prison, but I can't even begin to fathom. We like to think we're coddling prisoners, but we're not. The idea of not having control over your daily schedule, 6 counts a day, it just it's dehumanizing.
Well, and specifically, the men's prisons are notoriously violent and there's a lot like I mean, there's basically gang politics that establish themselves, and they're on, typically along racial lines, and it is. I mean, you're in a hellhole for if you are in a while you're in prison. It is hell. You're watching your back. You're worried you're going to get stabbed. You're worried someone's going to come and punk you and steal your shit, and you're going to end up being someone's bitch. And I went to, I actually, because I struggled with alcoholism for about 2.5 years, and I went to rehab with a gentleman who had entirely turned his life around. He'd spent almost 20 years in prison and then became a firefighter doing wildland firefighting.
Wow.
First, as a prisoner, he was being sent out to fight wildland stuff. And then after he got out, he became a real firefighter that is now, rising through the ranks as a convicted felon. And that's the first time I've ever gotten real insight into what prison was like. And I spent a month in a house with him and got to know him pretty good. And then obviously it also changed I don't even know if it changed my views or even like laid into my mind. It did change my views. It'd be on the grounds of, okay, you can redeem yourself. You can overcome this. You made some bad decisions early on. Now you're making good decisions. And again, I don't think people think about that either. Like you talked about, people think that we're coddling prisoners, and I'm sure there's some, minimum security prisons where you see like celebrities getting sent to where that probably is happening, and that is a byproduct of the privilege of who you know and the money that you have. But outside of that, I don't know that that's the case, and I do. But people again don't. I touched on this, I think, when during the intro, is like these are supposed to be reformative systems, and you are directly combating that recidivism that tends to happen, that cycle of, okay, now I've been in prison for 10 years. I have no money. Now I have to steal again. Or I guess you could say, yeah, you don't have to steal. You could starve to death or find a job. But like, how hard is it for these people? And that you see this firsthand. You've worked with 2,500 of these individuals, men and women. What are prospects like for them when they get out and when they come to your door? I mean, you've already said they're homeless. Like,
I would say it's 50% of what you and I would find if you're trying to find a job, because the felony box it scares a lot of people. We like to think murder, if somebody's convicted of murder, but murder is not what really scares people. It's sex offense.
yes,
And here's the irony. Absolute irony is that sex offense, we think, is a predator hiding in the bushes to grab your daughter. But the truth is, you may have been 17 years old, senior in high school, and the girl you're dating was 15, almost 16 in high school with you, and her parents knew you were dating, and you had a moment of intimacy, and then the parents found out, and they accused you of rape, and you ended up being labeled. We call that Romeo and Juliet, because it's not rape, but it's still illegally.
it's a statutory. Yeah.
And in our culture, that's so sexualized that it's what I grew up was that you didn't do those things uh, because good girls didn't do those things, only bad girls. But now we're finding uh, all people. It's so common. It's part of the dating process, and that greatly concerns me because uh, uh, just the legal issues alone. So what happens is, now let's suppose, put that aside. Let's suppose that was a one-time only offense, but you're still labeled for upwards of 10 years or 25 years, or you could be labeled for life, and you're not what we would call a sexual offenders, but legally you are.
Yeah, you're not a violent offender. That was a consensual act between two, well, I guess depending on where you're at, one underage and one legal age. But I agree that, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd say it's barely underage, but
Mhm.
and that's why we call it Romeo and Juliet. And here's the funny thing. Remember that movie, The Summer of '42? Uh,
I don't think so.
well, it was about a woman set in summer of 1942. There was a woman who lost her husband in the war, and she had this young boy, high school boy, who was always neighbor, always admiring her. And she was lonely. In a moment of remorse, she just found out her husband died, and and she took this boy into her arms out of sheer grief. And that movie was a hit because here was this guy who was 16 years old or so, and he got lucky, as we call it. But technically, that was a sexual offense. But
We don't view it that way when the offender is the woman.
that's
Like,
exactly
yeah,
exactly right. So we're in a sexualized culture, and that's not uncommon to have movies portraying that sort of relationship.
yeah. I had a woman on, I think she was like episode 30-ish. She's in the 30s or right around there. Raylene Weaver was a licensed marriage and family therapist, and she worked specifically with teen male sex offenders. And it was a lot of stuff like this, whether it was the, the separation of age where it's by like a year, but one is over the legal age and one is under it, or 2 years, like you mentioned, or even, a father finding out that his daughter had sent her boyfriend nude pictures of herself. And then, you press charges because you're angry and it ruins that kid's life. And I think, yes, I get that is illegal, have some repercussions for it, but that should not be on the same level as you are a predator out in society and you raped someone or, molested a child or that. But right now they are in the same bracket. I think that's a problem.
And the very fact that we're having this conversation, some people will say I'm defending that predator, and I'm not. I believe he should be held to a higher standard for what he has done, particularly with some victims who are quite young. But on the other hand, when he's done his time, if we don't shoot somebody or lock them up forever, then they're going to be released. What are you going to do? So the best option is to offer some degree of oversight, which is what we do for all people, regardless of your offense. Because if you want help, that we feel like we can at least offer that help. And here's the funny part was drugs are very, very common. Between 60 and 80% of what we deal with are either alcohol or drug addiction issues that led to a crime. And getting somebody housing who's had a drug offense many times is harder than housing for a sex offender because drugs are an ongoing addiction that are very hard for some people to overcome.
You don't think that's the case for a man who has molested a child in the past? I mean, in that,
Statistically, no. For some, it is. There are some who say
okay.
the sexual offender is never rehabilitated, and that's true for a percentage. But in
Mhm.
general, most sex offenders are what we call a one-off. It's the Romeo and Juliet.
I'm saying specifically in a predator, not in a Romeo and Juliet. I'm saying you get a man who was convicted at 40 for molesting his 10-year-old daughter.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the fullest extent of the law. Not even a question there.
Okay, so you do view them differently. Okay,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I do, so I was just seeing, like, I wanted to pick your brain on it if you didn't, but yeah.
But what would happen when that man he was he's sentenced to 25 years in prison, could easily be. What happens when he's released? What are we as a society going to do with him? We have two choices: keep him in prison or kill him. And the third choice is try to do some rehabilitation. That's what parole is about. It's if you get what we call a tail, you get oversight, legal oversight, where you have the authority. I don't, but the parole officer does, to keep an eye on him, including check phones, check messages, check his whereabouts, because it's monitored oversight. And so there are certain people, absolutely, that you must go the next level or the third level because they are predators.
And that's why, I guess I view that as a sickness. And that's why I was asking, like, because you had touched on the drugs and alcohol as an ongoing problem. These things aren't. That's what I was asking about, I guess,
Yeah,
was,
yeah. But we sometimes we think that all sex offenders are ongoing problems. And I would say all of them are not. Some of them are.
Okay.
Drugs across the board, statistically, as I understand it, it takes 7 times in rehabilitation to fully overcome an addiction, because an addiction, by its very definition, is addictive. And it's not like you simply say, I'm going to quit today, because 3 years from now, you may be in the same room with somebody who has some weed for you, or some smack for you, or meth for you, and you're in a weak moment and you try it. All of a sudden, that addiction comes raging back after 3 years of abstinence. That,
I've having dealt with addiction, I'm aware of that, and that's why I'm not aware. I didn't mean it like that. I meant very familiar with that. um,
yeah.
but not, I guess, and maybe I'm harping on this too much, but I'm, I think it's a valuable discussion, so that's why I'm coming back to it. I think that same situation, if you are an adult who is attracted to children, I think that's the same risk that you're running, where you get that person back in a position where they have the ability to abuse a child. That attraction, whatever it is, whether it's the byproduct of, your brain formed wrong, whether you were abused as a child, whatever that is, like that is still there. And you don't, uh, and that's how I view it, or how from the outside looking in, that's how it seems to me. And that, I guess, I was curious, do you have different
Well, I don't get into the actual uh, uh, deep casework, because somebody referred to me, and they're vetted by the Department of Correction, and
Okay.
they are deemed safe enough to be released.
Okay.
So they may have committed their crime 20 years ago, and they may be required to have ongoing counseling afterward from a clinician,
Okay.
uh, because they are considered to be higher risk. But and what we do is we keep case notes, and we keep ongoing contacts with the parole officer. And if we see anything that makes us uncomfortable, we pass that information on, and the parole officer will then get involved.
So it's all integrated with them, like you're partnering with them.
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely, because we like to be the eyes and ears, because legally it's they deserve, after they've done their legal sentence. We have said that you are required to do the sentence, and then when you're released, you're also required to be under supervision as a way of, and then you're also required to register with a sheriff for upwards of 25 years or a lifetime. So there's not simply you're on your own, and do what you will, because some people are, their notices are sent out to neighbors, so everybody knows that a man with a sex offense, or woman, lives in that house.
Yeah.
But here, irony is, we like to think it's strangers, but it's not. It's somebody in your family, it's somebody in your church, it's somebody in your school, in your daycare. It's known quantities. Right now, we're dealing with a lot of that with the Epstein case, because that's basically the same thing. He just happened to have money.
And was connected to a lot of other people who also have a lot of money. Yeah.
Exactly right. And I never have this conversation in this detail about this issue, because it's so sensitive that most people react emotionally. But I think if you're going to offer rehabilitation, it should be with caution, with trust but verify. You, across the board, we should say, if you're willing to try, we're willing to help. But if you're not willing to try, then we're going to come down to the full extent of the law.
Yeah. I have, and I guess part of the grounds of me pushing in on that specifically, I guess obviously it's my own personal beliefs around that, but I know a gentleman who works for one of the big 3-letter agencies here. We train at the same jujitsu gym together. He talked they just recently busted a house where it was a house for adult sex offenders having come out, like specifically who had victimized children and have come out and they busted the house. It was a house where these guys are supposed to be on the same guidelines and that under that same level of scrutiny. When they busted the house, every one of the dudes in that house had a hidden phone and these other things that they weren't supposed to have. And it's just, I don't, yeah, which I get your role here is to reform, not to reform, to help them get back on their feet. So I can step away from that.
Well, what we would do is we would send our case notes to the parole officer and say, my manager suspects. You might want to take a look at that. Or he's been acting different lately. You may want to drop him.
Yeah.
That means a drug test, because we look for changes in behavior, and or a roommate will say he's making me nervous, or he has another phone. So we'll pass that information on because we're not here to be the police, but we're also not here to encourage or to allow
Enable.
dangerous behavior. Not enabler. That's exactly
Yeah.
right.
Okay. And one thing, because I don't want to forget, and then I want to ask, come back to some of the stuff that we were talking about before I derailed you down that rabbit hole, but
Okay. Yeah.
that's the way these conversations go. So, when you had mentioned earlier with that first house that you guys started, you noticed changes in the neighborhood as you guys were kind of leading by example. Have you seen that phenomenon kind of take place at the other 16 facilities that you guys have?
Well, that's harder because we started off in a rural town outside of Dayton, Ohio, but most of our houses are in the inner part of Dayton, in
Okay.
the area where it's declined with the auto industry. And what used to be a very attractive neighborhood in 1945 now has, well, let's put it this way. It's not uncommon to walk down the street and have the local working girl ask me if she dropped her price from $20 to $5 because time for up.
God.
It took me a while to get used to it. When she said, "Do you want to ride?" I didn't know what she meant.
Yeah, fuck, dude, that's, is it,
I'd never been down that road.
yeah, is it, would you say, because I've laid eyes on Detroit when I could see, was it similar to Detroit, how dilapidated it is in Dayton?
Well, we lived in Detroit for years. My
Okay.
wife is from there, so Detroit is a whole different level of deterioration.
Okay.
But I would say that Detroit has what? How many? 250, 500,000?
I have no idea.
Well, there's 150,000 in Dayton, and
Okay.
it's still a farm town, but it's small, but yet large enough. And we're in an area where uh, uh, I would say that there are some burned down houses, there's some deteriorating houses. I was able to buy houses during the economic decline for 16, 25, $30,000, and now those same houses we've improved them. The neighborhood, because the economy has improved, there other buildings have been improved, but there's still blighted sections of the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so what we did in Greenville, my hometown, is a very small one block area.
Okay.
What we're doing in Dayton with so many houses, uh, the best we can do is we keep our lawns mowed, we keep our houses clean, and we daily inspect our houses, and the state audits our houses. So we just can't have a slum.
Okay. So what other accountability do the like you kind of touched on, the basic daily or activities of daily living, but I'm curious because faith is part of your life, if it's fair to call it faith or however you'd like to call it. And it sounds like it's also part of the operation there. Is that accurate?
Well, the Salvation Army is a faith-based organization.
Uh-huh.
But the Salvation Army does not require that you consent to their beliefs to have some food given to you or
Mhm.
clothing given to you. So that it motivates them to do what we say good works, but technically it's godly works too. So our faith is motivating us to do these things because we feel like it's part of our responsibility to God to reach out to our brothers and sisters who are struggling. But I don't require that you attend church. I don't require you, it's consent to my police, and I don't ask you questions about your faith. But if you ask a question, I'll tell you whatever you want.
Yeah.
But it's shoe leather faith.
Okay. What about in terms of employment and things like that? Is teaching them different skills part of what you guys do, or how does all that work?
We're very fortunate in Dayton that the county government is, for Ohio is a red state, but it's surprisingly progressive when it comes to rehabilitation.
Hmm.
And they started back in, oh, give or take 2000 with this rehabilitation program that we're a part of. And the idea is it's exactly what we've talked about, but the county government has a reentry office where they literally will take anybody on parole and offer them free classes on how to get a job. And then they have an 8 week, it's 8 week training. And then at the end of the 8 weeks, they have a ceremony where they get a certificate. It says you are a graduate. And then they provide a suit. And some of these guys have never had a ceremony, never had a suit, never graduated from anything. And I've seen grown men after 30 years in prison cry because they've gotten something, a success.
They
They've
recognize.
been
Yeah.
recognized. And I give credit, a lot of credit to the local government and to the state government. We criticize the government, but in Ohio, in this area, I think it's working very, very effectively.
That is so cool. Is Never mind. I'm not going to drag you down another rabbit hole.
Yeah,
So
we've been down too many rabbit holes today. Thank you.
yeah. So looking forward here, I know a lot of these folks are sent to you through, and it is a more local operation. Are you guys looking for more support from outsiders, or is there ways other people can take advantage of your services that aren't from that local Dayton area? How does all that look?
Well, there are other programs throughout the state. So,
Okay.
yeah, other states I can't point to and say, but under President George Bush, a lot of faith-based organizations started doing something like this back in 2000 when he was in office. And many of them have gone away, but ours has been able to continue. So I think faith is a very, very important motivator for many organizations. Food pantries today are becoming very, very critical. And in fact, there's a church just down the street from us. They provide food every week to many of our residents and many of the people in the community. Yeah, they do this without asking questions. They never charge a thing. Our guys just walk up there and they come out with 2 bags full of groceries, and it's just a lifesaver. Now, that to me is what the church does best.
Yeah.
Um, but I will tell you this, Zach. Yeah, what I found in trying to convince people in locally when we were having the conflicts, I presented data, I presented statistics, I said recidivism rates, and nobody heard me. So what I determined was what they heard was my clean house, my snowblower story. So what I decided to do was if I wanted to talk about rehabilitation, if I want to talk about second chances, nobody's going to listen to my data because my doctoral thesis was in second chance recidivism. It was about how the community benefits from programs like ours, and I think maybe 3 people read it. So I knew we weren't going to get community support reading a doctoral thesis.
Yeah.
So what I determined to do, and I thought of, think of it this way: if you want to have, you're going on a boat trip, a big boat, a cruise ship, and so you want to have people to watch a documentary on lifeboat safety. So you have this documentary, and you have everybody sit there and say it's voluntary, but I want you to come. Nobody will come to your documentary. But let's suppose you put that documentary into a fiction story of 2 lovers that were mismatched and how they were struggling, and they boarded the Titanic together. And everybody now understands how important lifeboats are.
Yeah.
And that's what I did with Running as Fast as I Can. I took a fictional story about a kid who grew up in poverty and abuse and how he ran from that through the 60s and 70s and how he's always running behind, always looking for a second chance, and how he had an emotional, psychological limp and he could never catch up. And that story has resonated so well with readers that it's garnered, actually, since we last talked, I just got the fiction book of the year for indie authors just yesterday.
Jesus. So 42 now?
48. There are three more.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's up to 48 awards since we talked.
Wow.
It's incredible, but we have sold the average independent book, which I'm an indie author, the average indie book sells 200 copies its first year and maybe 1,000 copies over a lifetime. My book has sold 22,000 copies. So,
And it was only published in 2023, right?
right, December, 2 years ago, well,
Wow.
almost today. So, and that's because the readers have written back to me, and I've had hundreds of people write to me and say, I lived that story. Daniel is me. I needed a second chance, or I cried the whole way through it. It made every one of the 10 years I took writing it worth every day of that, because that's exactly what I want. I don't want people to start their own Good Samaritan home. I want them to offer second chances to somebody they meet, and maybe give yourself a second chance first. That's what I want.
That is, I think, a pretty beautiful way to wrap this thing up. I looked it up, and I think you have almost 500 reviews on Amazon alone. Like that's
Yeah.
That's again twice what a typical book sells in a year. Like a typical indie author will sell a year. It just that's incredible, man. And you should. I hope you're proud of that. Like I hope you realize how big of an accomplishment that is.
I'm actually, I had 200 rejections trying to publish it. And with every rejection, I went back and edited. There's a lesson in that, for me at least, that is that you will have setbacks. You will have to edit your book or your life. That's what life means. It's a marathon. You will fall down, get up, and keep running. And so it's very, very important that we never quit. And that's when it's the hardest. That's when it's the most important that you keep trying. And let's suppose you're the last person that finishes crosses the line. It doesn't matter. You kept running. That's what matters.
Yeah. Problem is when you stop, because that is when, whatever, if you're not editing yourself or if you aren't continuing to get back up, that is when you start to fall into these areas of issue. That is when those things fester and they become problems and other
Absolutely.
things.
I guarantee if you stop, that's it. That's it.
Can I ask you one more question?
You
I was really curious thinking about this. How you touched on drugs and alcohol being a big component of a lot of these folks' stories. Have you run into many that were in a similar place to where you were, where they felt like they just, where they were stumbling and that led them down the wrong path? They just didn't, they made a different decision than you did, and they've now wound up years later coming through your door.
Interesting you should say that, because my wife has a way with people, and she'll ask questions. It's always, where was your mother? Where was your grandmother? And invariably, the vast majority of the guys we deal with, number one, the father was not there. Number two, the mother was likely not there. She was, on a good day, she was working two jobs to provide. On a bad day, she was dealing or hustling on the street to survive.
Yeah.
And so she was raised by grandma or the foster system. So they have no family structure. They were literally raised in the wild. And so, to a degree, I understood much of what they went through, because mine was not nearly so severe, but I understood the premise. And so it made me very sympathetic. I haven't been to prison, but I've been in similar loss situations as theirs.
Yeah. Well, I think again, So it's an incredible way to get to wrap this up. I will have links to everything to Good Samaritan Home. I will have links to Running as Fast as You Can, even though if you Google it, you will find it. I Googled it. So many links where it popped up. I can't wait to, you'll have to keep me posted as you keep winning more awards here. Thank you for what you're doing. And thank you for taking the time. I think the way that you're able to communicate all of this, even when we got into politics, it was not, there was no finger pointing. You did that in the same way that you've discussed, viewing all of us as equals and not doing the other anything that we talked about. And you're a great communicator, and I respect the way with which you've gone about it. So thank you.
And I will say the book is Audible version too.
Oh,
It's
okay.
Audible, but bring Kleenex, people. I guarantee you're going to need it because, like life, there's a lot of tears.
All right. I'm going to have to grab that version. So thank you again.
Actually, I wasn't sure my brain would last this long, but you've done a great job helping me keep my thoughts somewhere in a coherent state.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear it. That's the hope that I can help keep us on track. But all right. Thanks everyone at home for listening to another episode of Going In Blind. This was an incredible one. Please share it around with another curious mind who needs to hear it. And be sure to leave a rating and review wherever you're listening. And if that was on YouTube, hit the subscribe button so you get notifications about every episode that comes out each week. But I'll see you next time.